Hi, and welcome back. I am no longer in Barney Davis Hall. I am now at home, like probably most of you are. We've been kicked out of Barney Davis Hall. So we'll continue this. I've heard from most of you that you made it home or wherever your destination was, and you're safe and in a good place and just waiting this out like all of us. There's still a couple of you I'm waiting to hear from, but I think for the most part, we're in pretty good shape. So let's continue our discussion of environmental justice. Um, you will remember last time we considered some of the beginnings of the environmental justice movement in the United States. In some respects, this grew out of the 1960s civil rights era, although it wasn't exactly explicitly described in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but a lot of the same ideas applied to environmental justice. Now, in this lesson, we'll consider the global scope of environmental justice and what it might mean around the world. Some of this work that I'll share with you today comes from a scholar named Joan Martinez Allier. Just so you know, that's the source of some of my information. So let's start with this, the idea of the global north and the global south. We've already talked about those terms a little bit. And here's the basic idea that you could kind of draw a line around the globe, differentiating the rich north and the poor south. It doesn't quite work there because Australia and New Zealand would need to be lumped in with the north. But this idea has been around for about 40 years or so. Really, it originated in 1980. There was a German politician named Willy Brandt who proposed this idea in 1980 called the Brandt line, which is in the top diagram here. And it's pretty much what we just showed. It shows the wealthy countries more or less in the north and then the poor countries in the south. That idea has lost some of its value. So you can see in the bottom diagram, a lot of countries since 1980 have become more developed. Brazil and Argentina might be examples, so that they really don't belong in the global south anymore in the same way. So the idea of the global south and the global north and the Brandt line has sort of lost some of its value. It's not all that accurate anymore, but it's still used a lot. Even books and papers that come out here in 2020 are still using the terms global north and global south, so you'll still see those. Here's just a little graph showing that the terms global north and global south don't really mean anything. This is a graph of latitude versus human development index in 2017. And you can see that it doesn't really make a very straight line. So the idea of global north and global south really are inaccurate. People's environmental situation and economic situation is really not exactly related to their latitude. But still, we use these terms. Probably better terms, as we've used in class, are MDRs and LDRs, more developed regions and less developed regions. So we can think about comparing MDRs and LDRs in terms of their environmental justice situation. So how are they different? And you guys already know some of this because we talked about this in the demographic section. Certainly resource extraction is different in these areas. If you think about a lot of the resources that we use in the United States, some of them are extracted in the United States, like coal, for example, but a lot of our resources are extracted elsewhere in the world, and a lot of times they're extracted in LDRs and shipped to North America for our use. Waste disposal sometimes goes in the opposite direction, as I'll show you in a second. A lot of our waste, our regular municipal waste, is stored in landfills here in Ohio, let's say, but some of it is shipped around the world to less developed regions for disposal. There's this concept of ecologically unequal exchange, which is a fancy term for the trade between less developed regions and more developed regions is usually not an ecologically equal exchange. In other words, we are extracting resources from biomes in, let's say, South America, and what they are getting in return from us is our waste. So that's not really a very fair exchange. And then this idea of negative environmental externalities that we've talked about, a lot of times those are disproportionately falling on the shoulders of people in less developed regions. Climate change is a good example. So we are experiencing climate change here in Ohio, but we have the infrastructure to deal with it for the most part. In other parts of the world, they don't. And so they are getting the short end of the stick. So these are some of the things that are global issues of environmental. Here's a quick example, export of e-waste as we all sit in front of our computers or iPads or laptops. The wonderful electronics we have, of course, much of that is constructed or built in other parts of the world and shipped to the United States. And then our waste gets shipped back a lot of times to less developed parts of the world. So this little picture is showing you from Europe and North America. Our electronic waste often ends up not getting disposed of in Europe or North America, but in Africa or India or China or Southeast Asia. So we ship in products that were built elsewhere, and then we ship back our waste. Here is a picture from Ghana that I found online. It is an e-waste dump. And this person is working in the e-waste dump and trying to recover copper from some of the things that were disposed of. And the best way they have to do that, or at least the most efficient way, is to burn the material and then try to fish out the copper as things are burning. So you can imagine that smoke that this person is being exposed to is full of all sorts of toxins. This would be a horrible place to work. And a lot of that electronic waste comes from the global north, comes from more developed countries, but it's being disposed of in Ghana in this case. Here's another picture of people working in an e-waste dump, and they're trying to recover materials from things that have been disposed of, old tools, old computers, old printers, and things like that. So that's just an example of how the unequal exchange is allowing a lot of the waste disposal to happen in less developed parts of the world. So the basic thought is we shouldn't really base environmental justice on latitude, but rather on human condition. So we could have conditions of what we call the global south. Those could occur in a city like New York or Tokyo or London. It doesn't have to be in the south exactly. Global environmental justice concepts are not really latitude based. But in general, many dispossessed people of the world, that's a term that means people that don't have access to environmental goods, or they bear a lot of the environmental bads. Dispossessed people have a different environmental reality than people who are comparatively wealthy. So in this sense, we have at least two different environmentalisms. The author I referred to earlier is one of the authors that has come up with this term full belly environmentalism or full stomach environmentalism. Maybe you've heard of that before. So people that lived in more developed parts of the world, like most of us, are full belly environmentalists. That means we don't have to worry about where our next meal comes from, and we are not hungry on a day-to-day basis usually. And so that sort of environmentalism emphasizes values of the post-industrial society, things like nature preservation and preserving majestic landscapes and protecting species like polar bears and having recreational access to beautiful areas and having technology that allows us to live a comfortable life while reducing our environmental footprint, or at least feeling like we're reducing it. So this little picture unfortunately looks an awful lot like me right now. This person is looking at a laptop, holding a phone. They have an iPad there. They have a cup of what it probably holds coffee. And so here I am with my laptop and my cup of coffee, and my iPad is over there and my phone is over there. And this is a sort of environmentalism, and it's not necessarily bad. It's just a reality that in wealthier parts of the world, the kind of environmentalism we are doing is very different than in some other parts of the world. We're trying to become more efficient without changing our really privileged lifestyle. Empty belly environmentalism occurs in less developed regions, and this is very different. It's less about protecting iconic species or beautiful landscapes. It's more about basic necessities. So the right to use resources, equal distribution of resources, recognition and participation in decision making, fair treatment in terms of things like waste disposal and access. This is the type of environmentalism that is really the essence of global environmental justice. And this picture is from India, and it's a woman carrying water. In lots of parts of the world that are water stressed, a good part of the day for a lot of people, particularly women, is hauling water from a water source. So for this particular woman, probably one of her environmental concerns is that that water stays accessible and clean for her and her family to use. That's very different than wishing we could protect polar bears. Both of those are okay sorts of environmentalism. They're just very different. So full belly and empty belly environmentalism. So I'll show you some statistics or some tables here that show you kind of the types of global environmental conflicts around the world. This table just shows you different sorts of conflicts. So a lot of them are extraction based, like extracting uranium or mineral ores or doing waste management. Some of these are biomass and land conflicts. Some of them are about fossil fuel use and climate justice. Some of them are about water management. Some of them are about biodiversity or tourism use of land. And a lot of times these are conflicts because one group of people is, like I said, getting the short end of the stick. They are where the extraction happens. They're where the waste disposal happens. They're where the land is being grabbed by a corporation or another institution to use for some use that they don't approve of. A lot of times this is called slow violence because it is violent to the people that live there, but it's not the kind of violence that happens very rapidly. It happens over maybe many months or many years. They're slowly losing their rights and losing access to things that they have long had access to. So who is protesting these sort of things around the world? There are local environmental justice organizations, but a lot of these are sort of blue collar, people that work on the land, neighborhoods, citizens, farmers, indigenous groups, women, fishermen, peasants, religious groups. These are people living in these communities that are protesting how they're being treated. And a lot of times they don't have a lot of political backing. It's individuals and small groups of individuals. How are they protesting? This graph is just showing you some of the global environmental justice concerns around the world. Sometimes they're writing letters or holding protests, public campaigns, street protests, creation of reports and sharing of data, blockading ports and things like that. Sometimes these get a little bit more confrontational and a little bit more violent, like land occupation, or going on strike, or actually trying to sabotage the development in particular areas. These are sometimes the only ways people have to protest what's happening, that they are being denied access to the basic human rights that they have long had and should have access to. How do these protests turn out? There's a whole range of outcomes. Sometimes they're positive. So in some cases, the indigenous group or the group that's being has the short end of the stick gets increased participation in decision making. Sometimes they get some financial compensation for the affected land that they've lost or resources that they've lost. Sometimes they're able to win a moratorium, in other words, stopping the project altogether. A lot of times the outcomes are not very positive, they're negative. So the people that lived on that land are actually displaced. They have to move away because the land has been purchased or the resource has been purchased by a corporation from another country. Sometimes the activists and the protesters are criminalized and put in prison. Sometimes there's violence against them, and sometimes they're even murdered. So in some parts of the world, people that are protesting environmental justice situations can actually be killed for protesting. So what I want you to understand is that there's not one single global environmental justice movement, but there are many specific ones, and I'll just give you a few examples. So there's a food sovereignty movement. This is trying to defend people's right to define and grow and harvest their own food, to do agriculture in their own way, because in some parts of the world that right is being lost. There's a biopiracy movement. This reflects back to the GMOs that we looked at in class a few weeks ago. This is fighting against corporate appropriation of genetic resources in plants and animals and fungi and bacteria without recognizing the rights of the indigenous peoples of where those plants occur. So that's an interesting aspect of environmental justice. There's a water justice movement trying to guarantee clean water access as a basic human right. A few others. There's a world rainforest movement that is working to keep indigenous forests free of monoculture plantations like the palm oil dilemma that we talked about a few months ago. Indigenous rights movements, like the readings I had you do for this week, are trying to work with countries to protect the rights of indigenous people. Something like 370 million people in the world are still considered part of indigenous tribes or groups still living on the land they have long lived on, but their rights are in jeopardy. So these groups are trying to help guarantee those rights. Corporate accountability. Of course, a lot of these environmental justice issues are the result of a company or a corporation, often from the wealthy part of the world, that is trying to extract resources or dispose of waste in a less wealthy part of the world. And corporations could do a lot to sort of curtail these activities and make them more justice than injustice. And so there are a lot of corporate accountability organizations trying to demand that corporations pay attention to environmental and human rights. Toxic colonialism, it's an interesting term. This is trying to oppose the long distance transport of waste like the e-waste I just showed you, because really that shouldn't happen. If we are using products here in the United States, for example, then we should probably dispose of the waste in the United States and deal with the waste ourselves, not ship it off to some other part of the world to let them deal with our problems. But unfortunately, that too often happens. So these sort of groups are trying to right that wrong. There are others that fall under this category of global environmental justice. Together, recently, some authors have called this the global commons movement or the commons movement. And this is the idea that a lot of these issues are really about common resources or common bads like waste disposal and climate change. And really, we need to think of the world as one great big commons. So if you think back to our tragedy of the commons and Elinor Ostrom's suggestions for preventing it, that worked on a small scale, you might think, how could this work on a global scale? Is there a way we could do that? One organization of many that are trying to think about this is called the Global Commons Alliance. If you're interested, you could poke on their website, the Global Commons Alliance, and just see what sort of work they're doing. It's an interesting question because the commons, some of the solutions to our tragedy of the commons work well on a small scale. We can all talk to each other and come to a solution. It's more difficult when you're talking about 7.5 billion people trying to come to some sort of agreement on how to use these resources in a fair way. Okay, so now here's your turn, part 2. Last time I had you use that website called EnvJusticePart2 I hope you found that useful and interesting. I think it's a really interesting resource. And I asked you to create 2 different side-by-side maps of possible environmental justice locations in the United States. And to put those on a Word document. If you've been able to do that, hopefully you're able to get a screenshot of those and paste them into a Word document. Give them both little captions that sort of describe what I'm looking at here and what's the situation and what sort of data you compared, so I know what I'm looking at. And if you can get those into a Word document, that was part 1. Part 2, we're going to use another cool website that looks at some global issues of environmental justice. This one's called EJ Atlas. You can find it by Googling EJ Atlas. Duh, you should be able to find that, and it pops up pretty easily. And there's a bit of a learning curve. It looks like this, but you'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly. This is a map of the world, and each dot on here represents a case of environmental justice, or injustice, if you want to call it that. And there are all kinds of colors. You can figure out what the colors mean, and you can filter these or choose different sorts of them. If you go to featured maps at the top there, and you can filter them by country, so you could zoom in on a particular country, or by commodity like water or minerals or fossil fuels, or you could even do it by company. So you could focus on a particular company like Monsanto and see where in the world have there been environmental justice claims against Monsanto. And then for each one, you could click on a dot and you can read about it in the little scroll bar on the right. And there's all sorts of information about what that situation is. So this is a really interesting environmental justice website also for the whole globe. It doesn't work quite the same way as the EnvJusticePart2 one, but it's a different way of looking at environmental issues. So here's what I'd like you to do. Using screenshots and captions like we did before, create 3 more figures that highlight and explain 3 environmental justice cases from around the world. And I would ask you to not choose places in the United States for this. Pick something out of the United States. So I want you to do one that's based on a country. So pick one country in the world and look at and create a map of, screenshot of some of the environmental justice cases, and then give that a caption that describes what are some of the environmental justice cases in that part of the world. And then do another one that's based on a company, like Monsanto as my example, and talk about in your caption to that figure what are some of the issues that Monsanto is causing or creating or helping to create in an environmental justice sense. And then your third one is going to be on a commodity, like let's say water, and you're showing a figure that shows some of the water environmental justice issues around the world, and then give me a little caption that sort of explains what some of those are. So altogether, this should give you 5 figures that are screenshots from these websites, 2 from the EnvJusticePart2 from the United States and 3 from the EJ Atlas from around the world. Each of them should have a descriptive caption in your own words that describes what it's showing. And if you need any help with capturing screenshots, just drop me an email, or better yet, email one of your friends in the class and they might be able to help you figure out how to do that if you're having trouble doing screenshots. Finally, add to this a written reflection that'll be about 2 paragraphs long. So here's what I want you to reflect on. So EJ Screen and EJ Atlas are 2 ways of looking at environmental justice, but they show them in very different ways. So I want you to think about and explain how they explore similar aspects of environmental justice and how they are different. In other words, how is environmental justice perceived differently using these 2 tools in 2 different parts of the world, in the United States and outside of the United States? Then relate your response to the general difference in environmental justice concerns in the less developed, in other words, the empty belly environmentalism, and the more developed regions, the full belly environmentalism parts of the world. So I think you could do this in about 2 paragraphs. I will place on Notebowl a sample of this that I put together so that you can look at how you might create this. Of course, you should choose different subjects than I did. Don't choose the same ones that I did. And I would like you to turn this in on Notebowl by next Wednesday, which is April 1st at midnight, just like we turn in other things. I will make a little place on Notebowl that's called EJ Lab or Environmental Justice Lab that you could submit this. Since it'll be April 1st, that means March will be over. Yay, I've never been a fan of March, and this March has been particularly bad. March 2020 sucks. Die, March, die. On to April, I say. So you can upload your final document to Notebowl on the EJ Lab, Environmental Justice Lab, by next Wednesday. As always, if you have questions about how to do this, you can email me, or you could connect with a classmate to ask them how they figured this out, and then you can create your own and upload your own document. Okay, so our next topic on Friday will be political ecology, which is a way of studying these environmental justice concerns around the world in sort of an academic sense, and a topic that I think will be interesting to a lot of you. So be sure to read in your book, I think it's chapter 4.14 on political ecology, and we'll talk about that next time. Until then, be well and remain coronavirus free. If you are already, that's good, and let's stay that way. So stay sequestered and hang in there for a few more weeks that we need to do this. Until next time then, I will see you later.